Everyone thinks I'm a human version of a bulldog. I'm pretty direct, and when I latch onto something, they compare it to a bulldog's fangs around a throat. I don't let go and I don't give up. I follow every action to its logical end. Many think I'm the luckiest son of a bitch in the world when all I really am is prepared. In everything I do, I make sure I'm as ready as possible to make it a pleasant ending for me. I'm more of a wolf in a bulldog's skin because I sniff around things from every angle I can think of to ascertain any weaknesses in the business or person. Never underestimate the value of research. Personally or professionally, I exhaust every avenue available to me before I decide on a plan of action. It's one of the many reasons I have a successful business. If I have a new vendor or new customer, I find out all there is about them and don't take anything at face value. They may look good on paper, but if I dig deeper, I may find out they're right in the middle of an ugly divorce where their company may be compromised. Or maybe they declared bankruptcy 3 years ago in another state. Some may be involved in affairs with either sex and not be particularly discreet, or associate with people of questionable character who may negatively impact their business, in turn, impacting mine. I'm sort of like a venture capitalist, which can be a kind of term for legal loan shark if you wanted to get nasty about it. I've accumulated a little money over my life and managed to increase it substantially by investing wisely with people in whom I had a high degree of confidence. I'm not infallible. Some things don't work out, but my success ratio is about 80%. So I'm able to absorb a loss and move on. Often, it's a learning experience that gives me better insight into the next deal. Widely diversified, I have a finger in a lot of things. I had a friend who was a hell of a trainer with several degrees in physical therapy and sports medicine. She was very good at what she did, but she had no business sense at all. When she approached me about opening her own business, I researched it with my usual fanaticism and dragged her along. She learned a great deal in a short time about how her industry worked, and in the end, we agreed it was a viable opportunity, so I set her up. I owned 60% starting out but wasn't actively involved, except for the business aspects, and there was a standard buyout clause I put in every contract that allows the minority owner to buy me out over a 5 to 10 year term. There's also a clause in the contract that if the business starts failing, I step in, analyze the data, and decide whether to take over management or shut it down. I've had to do that 3 times, and I took it as a personal affront every time. I had invested in an advertising agency early on, and it was very, very successful. They were approached by some heavy hitters who wanted to buy them out and have them work for their organization. Bob and Jan called me for help, and we went over the offer. It was attractive, but I showed them that as their reputation grew, they could be bigger than the company trying to buy them out in 15 years. They declined the offer, and over the years, it's been very profitable to me. I still own 20% through the structured buyout program we'd agreed to, and in 4 years they'd be completely independent. My usual practice was to use who I had worked with earlier to help make my newer investments successful. Bob did a carefully crafted campaign for Jody's rehabilitation clinic, and in 2 years she franchised and now has offices in every southern state and parts of the Midwest. I own just a bit of each one because she insisted it made her feel safer. The guy who started me down the path I was on was an old-time wheeler dealer who liked to fly under the radar. Over his lifetime, he probably paid about 20% of the taxes he really owed and got away with it. I wasn't quite that brave, and my deals were pretty straightforward and transparent. Besides, with the advent of computers, it was a lot harder to slip anything by the tax man. It was the reason Great Uncle Harry avoided technology like the plague. There had been a scandal at an accounting firm in my town. It seems no one was watching them watch other people's money, and they had taken advantage, to the tune of $12 million. They got caught, and the owners went to jail. The money was never found. It piqued my interest, so I bought the business for a song. The old owners were desperate to pay their lawyers, so they didn't profit from it. I kept 3 of the junior accountants who weren't involved and built the business slowly. Their core business came from making sure the companies I invested in were on the straight and narrow and provided expert advice when they needed it, and usually, they meant me. I had changed the name, and the guys I had were good, managing to get about 25% of their old customers who hadn't been stolen from back, so it was starting to show a pretty decent increase in revenue stream. I offered the 3 originals a buyout deal that they jumped all over. 6% a year for 10 years. They had 7 more years to go. By then, I was 32 and pretty happy with all aspects of my life but one. I was lonely. I dated a good bit, but had never found the one. Harry's wife had gotten tired of his many affairs and had destroyed him in the divorce. Seems she knew a good bit more about his business than he thought. When she got done with him, the IRS came knocking. The only thing that kept him from jail was me. It was a near thing, but he had to pay an estimated amount of $214,000 in penalties and taxes. If he could do that, they let him off with 3 years of probation. He had the money but couldn't explain where it came from, so I loaned it to him. That put me under the microscope, but my transparent ways paid off. Harry was paying me back at a pre-agreed rate from his salary as one of my warehouse managers, plus twice the amount under the table. He'd be out of my debt by the time the probation was over. My great-aunt was acting out of anger and pain, but it made me appreciate the need to get things out in the open should I ever find a woman I loved enough to marry. A prenuptial was a given, and I would make sure there were some pretty stringent penalties in the case of infidelity from either spouse. I'd even talk to my lawyer about it, and he gave me the groundwork, with the details to be worked out when the time came. An only child of parents who never had any deep family ties, I was pretty much alone in the world. It made me want a family, a large family, pretty badly. I wanted a minimum of 3 children, and if one of them came with a mother, I'd consider it a bonus. I was young, not unattractive, and had enough money to make the dates high-end. There had been 2 pretty serious relationships in my life. One was going along fine, and she was hinting for a commitment when I explained the prenup she'd have to sign. She balked, saying we were in love and would be together forever. When that didn't work, she turned into a shrew of an epic magnitude. We just gradually drifted apart. 6 months later, she married an up-and-coming businessman who came from old money. 6 months later, they were in divorce court, and she was trying to squeeze every dime possible out of him. She partially succeeded, getting almost everything he'd accumulated, but the family money was locked up in a trust, and there was no way she could get to it. He almost lost his little company until I stepped in. 3 years later, he's worth far more than he was when he was married. Is engaged to a very nice young lady with a child from a previous marriage who seemed to love him more than her mother, and they were house shopping. I set it up with one of the 2 real estate offices in which I had an interest. In the same time frame, his first wife had married and divorced twice more, getting very little out of each failed marriage. I saw her at lunch one day, and she blamed me for everything. I just grinned. I'm not the cause of all your problems, honey. Just the big ones. All the rest is on you. It was bullshit, of course, but she believed it. I had gotten frustrated looking for love, so I backed off. Love ran into me in the hallway of the advertising agency. I was a pretty big guy and she was a waif of a woman. I found out later she was 5 foot even and weighed 90 pounds when I met her. After I helped her up, admiring her legs, I apologized and introduced myself. Hi, I'm Roy, a pleasure to run into you. She bit back the sharp retort that was on her lips and looked at me more closely. I was giving her my most, no harm grin, and she sighed. I should watch where I'm going, sorry. No harm done. Are you all right? As good as one can get when they bounce off a stone wall. Let me guess, you work out a lot. I had to admit I was in pretty good shape, thanks to Jody. She mapped out my meals, my exercise routine, and would frown at me when I went off course. Then again, I had a thing for craft brews. Most were terrible, as brewers made the most common of mistakes, thinking higher alcohol percentage meant better beer. A lot of them figured it out, but some didn't, and they didn't last. I financed the startup of my favorite brewer after he gave me some samples of what he did at home. He was a little afraid at first, but we guided him along. The accountants looked after his finances, the ad guys did a viral campaign, plus billboards, and ads in local and state magazines. His demand was higher than his production, but he was ruled by some pretty draconian restrictions, the result of the powerful lobby sponsored by the big boys. A few even tried to pass off some of their product as microbrews, but were outed pretty quickly. I was one of his focus group, and he thought a lot of my opinion. I grinned at her, a little. I wouldn't classify myself as stone. She absently rubbed her bottom. The term knocked on her butt wasn't just an expression any longer. Sure, felt like it from my end. As interesting as it is to meet you, I have to go back to work. We parted and I wondered what she did there. Jan told me she was a new associate, fresh from college with a master's degree and unbounded enthusiasm. I saw her a few more times when I had to visit the office. When we got around to exchanging names, it was all we could do not to laugh. My name was Roy McCoy, and hers was Jimmy Choo. Not related, she told me, and I don't think his shoes are worth the price. We had coffee twice, followed by a few lunches before going on a real date. We got a few looks from other diners at the really nice restaurant I'd taken her for our date. I was over 6 feet tall and pretty thick, thanks to Jody, and she was a tiny little oriental beauty over a foot shorter. I never told her I'd bankrolled the restaurant, and it was doing very well. Jimmy was half Korean and half Japanese, and in my opinion, inherited the best physical traits of both. She told me there was a lot of resentment between the two, going all the way prior to World War II, because of the many atrocities the Japanese had inflicted on the Koreans, and it was what prompted her parents to come to North America. She was raised mostly in Canada and had only moved there 4 years previously. You could still hear the Canadian influence in the way she pronounced certain words, and it was kind of cute. I told her my story. Born and raised locally. 1 year of community college before I dropped out. An inheritance from a great-grandmother I never knew existed gave me the seed money to start my business. I could tell she was impressed. Wow, you must be really smart. I grinned. Not really. I just got some good advice from a really successful man. He told me you didn't have to be the smartest man in the room. You just had to be smart enough to figure out who was and harness their intelligence. Most geniuses aren't very business savvy. That's where I fit in. You must be very successful. I thought back on my failures. Sometimes. There's been a few times when I've fallen on my butt, but I consider each failure a learning experience. I then put her in tears laughing over tales of a few of my failures. You really thought that was a good idea? Not now, but at the time I thought it made sense. We had an enjoyable evening just getting comfortable with each other. After the meal, I took her to a performance by our local amateur theater group. They were pretty good and were doing the stage version of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The plants in the audience kept things lively, calling the guy who played Brad a hole at different times, and when the scene where Dr. Frank Hinfurter asked Brad if he had tattoos rolled around, one of the plants yelled out, "A-holes don't have tattoos?" The man playing the doctor looked at the audience and grinned. "Mine does." Jimmy lost it, laughing so hard she gave herself hiccups. I was a sponsor and talked to everyone at the meet and greet after the show, and Jimmy got into all kinds of conversations with the actors. The woman who played Janet appeared still in her bra and half-slip and struck up a conversation with her. "Aren't you uncomfortable wearing just your underwear?" Celeste, the actress, grinned. "No, honey, I kind of get off on it. I got a pretty good rack and I like to show it off. You should see our vacation pictures. What does your husband say?" About that time, her husband, Jack, appeared at her side, still in his jockeys. He played Brad in the production. I grinned when I saw Jimmy's eyes go to his groin. Let's just say Jack didn't have to stuff his shorts. Celeste jumped a little, and I knew he'd grabbed her bum. They had been married 5 years and were devoted to each other, although after a late night and 2 bottles of wine, they both told me they were adventurous and not adverse to playing with discreet partners. Celeste was looking at me with naked lust, but what freaked me was her husband had the same gleam in his eye while he stared at my crotch. I left shortly after. Just as I reached the door, her bra flew by me. I didn't turn around. I took Jimmy home, and she asked me to wait in the hall for a minute. When she called me in, she was standing on a step stool, wearing a robe. As soon as I closed the door, she dropped the robe and stood before me in a white bra and half-slip. "Tocha tocha touch me. I want to be dirty," she sang as she motioned me closer. It was a very prolonged goodnight kiss that involved a lot of light touches until she finally pushed me away. "That's a really good start, baby. It's too soon to go farther, but time will take care of that if you continue to ask me out." Later on, I found out to my surprise that when we were horizontal, we were exactly the same height. I tried to be gentle because of her size, but she was having none of it. "I won't break, baby, but I'd like you to try." After that, I tossed her around like a rag doll, rolling her into one position after another until she screamed, orgasmed, and passed out. I stopped, not sure what to do. She came to her senses a few seconds later and started back like we'd never stopped. She was purring with happiness as she lay on top of me after we were done, going to sleep instantly. After that, we were joined at the hip. 3 months later, she was living with me. 6 months after that, she was wearing my ring. It was her birthday and I gave her the first of her gifts, a pair of Jimmy Choos with a 4-inch heel. Jimmy grinned and told me I'd wasted my money, but tried them on anyway. Ouch, there's something in the toe of this one. She shook it into her hand and a ring fell out. She just stared at it for a few seconds. Then she looked at me. "Is this?" By then I was on my knee. She was pretty strong to be as small as she was, knocking me on but when she launched into my arms, I noticed by the time I managed to get us off the floor, she had the ring on her finger. We married with the correct amount of pomp and circumstance in front of friends and family the next June. Went somewhere warm and mostly clothes optional for our honeymoon, and settled into domestic bliss. I was truly happy. Jimmy loved her job, one she was very good at, and I muddled along in my usual fashion. I invested heavily in a security firm when the principal owner caught his wife fooling around and handled it badly. Ruined genitals for the lover, permanent limp for the wife. Off for 5 years as a guest of the state. It had been fairly successful, and I got it at a huge discount because he needed all the money he could raise to pay off his ex and criminal lawyers. He'd had a prenup, or she would have taken the business. The guy I got to run it was retired Army with 15 years as a CID inspector. I was surprised that there was very little actual detective work. It was the digital age, and he assembled a group of geeks with very good skills, so most of what they did required very little legwork. He trained them all, anyway, and they were perfect. Who's gonna think a geek with a laptop is any threat? I worked with them setting it up, and it made me paranoid as hell. If you had any digital presence at all, you were toast, not mentioning cameras. By the time all the changes had been made, there were only 3 original employees left. They did mostly corporate work. I had them do a once-over of all the businesses I had a hand in. Jimmy was not happy when I presented the prenuptial agreement to her. We almost didn't get married over it until my lawyer and hers worked out a compromise. I put $250,000 in a trust and had to add 5% a year to it. If the marriage broke up because I cheated, she got the money and that was it. If she was caught cheating, then she walked away with nothing other than what we accrued jointly, accepting my business. It seemed to me there at the end it was more of a business transaction than a marriage, but I knew neither of us would ever cheat, so it was just so many words written on a paper both of us would forget about over time. Apparently, I was wrong. We'd been married a little over 4 years. I thought life was good. We were both fit, active people with a good circle of friends. A cousin got me hooked on whitewater kayaking. Jimmy went a few times before deciding it was not for her and urging me to be careful. My cousin drove the point home. You're not indestructible, and you can't breathe water. Every time we go out, you push the envelope a little farther, wanting to shoot rapids that are frankly just a little too dangerous and that need portaged around. There's a reason water has classifications, and you don't need to go out alone. Who knows what you're liable to do without calmer minds around? You keep taking stupid chances, and I'm not going out with you anymore. I don't want to be the one to tell Jimmy you died doing something you knew was dangerous. Jimmy got hooked on the local theater guild productions. We got season passes and often took friends along to enjoy something a little different. 3 of the companies I was involved with were patrons, as well as my company and Jimmy and I individually. I worked summers in construction growing up, and I often helped with set construction. Jimmy came along, painting, sanding, everything she could do to help out. One night, a few hours before opening curtain on a new production, one of the actresses called. She'd been in an accident and was in the hospital with a broken leg, in traction. The director was about to panic when his eyes fell on Jimmy. It's 2 lines and very little movement. Help me out here. She was scared to death the first night. You could tell by the look on her face. By the time the curtains closed on the final performance, she was hooked. Everyone said she was a natural, and as she gained experience, her skills improved until she was often in second lead roles. The time commitment was a lot larger than I expected, but she loved it, so I didn't complain much. I finally expressed how much I missed our time together, and she cut back, roughly skipping every 3rd production. She bonded with a lot of the actors, and they were frequent guests in our home. Celeste and Jack became good friends, and while the flirting and innuendo flew when we were alone, they were careful to respect boundaries. One day, Jimmy and I had a discussion about Jack and Celeste's swinging lifestyle. To reinforce my stand on sex outside the marriage, I'll say this. If you want to play, we'll play. Just be prepared to move out right afterwards. There will be no coming back from it, you understand? Jimmy started a little like she was coming out of a dream. Of course, honey. There was no need to say that. She agreed, but I could see in her eyes she was a little disappointed. Jimmy came home from a theater guild meeting a few weeks later looking starry-eyed. I got the lead. I knew she was excited and gave her a big hug and kiss. You'll kill it. Celeste better watch her butt. She giggled. Jack and Philip are taking care of that. Well, good for them then. I like them, but I can't help but think they'll push it too far one day, and it will be the end of them. One or the other will do something they just can't come back from. They're totally in love. I know it's not our lifestyle, but it seems to work for them, and from what they tell me, it keeps things exciting in the bedroom. I grinned at the way she gushed. Not rethinking this whole monogamy thing, are you? She blushed and grinned. Never. I like what we have just fine. In fact, why don't we go into the bedroom and I'll remind you of that. One problem. What's that, honey? The bedroom's too far away. I was on her before she could react. Maybe I got a little too excited when I ripped off her panties, but I made it up the next day with a trip to the local high-end lingerie shop. That place had been in business before anyone knew who Vicky was, and their selection put the national chain to shame. It was a lot of fun, and I almost laughed out loud when the grand motherly woman who waited on us gave Jimmy a tour of the fetish room, barely containing her excitement as she showed her the floggers. Jimmy did pick up something from the room, a chainmail bra that looked great on her perky little boobs. She told me she was going for something I couldn't tear. We were rocking right along and had even started talking about children. Jimmy didn't have any siblings either, and she would waffle between 3 children one day and 4 the next. I was on board whatever number she picked. I had another project going. Our favorite restaurant went out of business due to poor management. The chef came to me with a proposal. We'd buy the defunct restaurant, furniture and all, remodel a bit, line up really good staff to help in the kitchen, and an experienced host or hostess to manage the dining room. I'd invested in a restaurant early on and had turned a pretty good profit on it. It folded about a year after I got out. With no one there to oversee the finances or keep the ego of the chef in check, it went downhill fast. He called, trying to get me to reinvest, but I declined. He'd already damaged the reputation of the place too badly to come back. Restaurants on the whole have a horrific failure rate, and my accountants were dead set against it this time. The security guys checked the chef out, and he came out squeaky clean with a really good reputation. He'd already turned down 2 lucrative job offers because his wife didn't want to relocate, and I knew he was pitching his idea to 2 more investment groups. In the end, I decided to go for it. I could write most of it off if it failed, but I believed in my heart it would last. I got the business for a song, the owner trying to make just enough to keep from declaring bankruptcy. I held a 60% stake in it, the chef putting up a little cash and his reputation to make his 40%. As usual, I wrote a buyout clause into the agreement, 5% a year after 2 years. The real estate company lined us up with some very good construction contractors. The refurbish looked even better than we thought it would and came in under budget. Maybe it was time to look into the construction business. Jimmy put together a very good ad campaign, including viral, and the first night we were open we were at full capacity. The meal was free and the diners were selected at random through a lottery online. We reserved a few tables for food critics and writers. They got a sampling of the best dishes, and the articles and word of mouth were amazing. I made it a point to be there. Jack and Celeste were our guests, mainly because Celeste ran a food blog. They brought their friend Philip along, and I thought he was a little conceited and thought way too much of himself as an actor. He'd been in a few local commercials, some bit parts in films being made in the area, and had done a 6-week guest run on a daytime soap. He just couldn't seem to understand why Hollywood wasn't knocking on his door. Despite that, he seemed harmless and was actually a bit funny. It occurred to me maybe he'd missed his calling as a stand-up comic. His date was Cynthia, one of the board members and main director. She was about 10 years older than Philip and obviously smitten. She was also very married, to a man with an unforgiving nature. I wondered if he knew where she was. She knew me, and more importantly, knew my ethics. I'm so glad when Celeste called and asked if I'd fill in so Philip wouldn't be a fifth wheel. With Jim being gone for a week and not getting home for another 4 days, I was climbing the walls. It's so good to get out with friends. She was selling, but it smelled like snake oil to me. I wasn't buying it, but maintained a neutral demeanor. Not my problem, but if what I suspected was true and Jim ever found out, Philip wouldn't be auditioning for leading man roles anymore. His facial modifications would put him in the quirky sidekick zone, and he'd deserve every lump he was going to get. Celeste looked at me and grinned. She knew what I was thinking. We'd become good friends, better friends than Jack and I would ever be, and she lived her life by her own standards, openly, so I had nothing to judge. The food was excellent and the conversation was stellar, except for Philip's contributions. Celeste would deliberately say things he couldn't understand and then grin when he floundered. It was mean, but enjoyable. If looks could kill, Cynthia would have had Celeste on the ground. Oddly, it seemed to upset Jimmy as well, although she tried hard not to show it. It made me wonder how long it took before he was able to remember his lines. After a decadent dessert served with really rich coffee, Jack and Philip suggested we go to a club to work off some of the calories. I can't. I have to stay and press the flesh, remember? Gene would have a fit if I threw him to the wolves. He can cook with the best of them, but he can't network for shit. We're working on that. Celeste said the same. I have to stay, as well. I have to interview the chef and get patron reaction. Then I have to come back tomorrow and photograph some of the dishes and take casual shots of the diners. I would have done it tonight, but I wanted to enjoy the meal from a customer's viewpoint. Do you mind if we go ahead? You guys can catch up with us when you're done. Celeste frowned at Jack while Philip grinned. Jimmy chimed in. Would you mind? This way I can get all the fast ones out of the way, and when you get there we can just grind on each other until we can't take it anymore. We watched them go and Celeste turned to me, placing a hand on my arm. It'll be fine, Roy. Nothing will happen. I just grinned. Who are you trying to reassure, honey? Me or you? She sighed. Jack's been pushing the envelope a bit lately. I thought we were really in tune with each other in our relationship, but now I'm starting to worry. Your life, Celeste. If you want my opinion, if it bothers you, get it out in the open. I think lifestyle aside, you're a fine woman and Jack is a fool if he jeopardizes your relationship. You could replace him in a heartbeat, but he'll never again find anyone like you." Tears came to her eyes, and she hugged me pretty hard. Collecting herself, she grinned at me. "If it all falls to shit, and I'm a free agent, I'm going to watch Jimmy like a hawk waiting for her to screw up. It will never happen, but if it ever does, I'll be all over you. And Roy, it would be just you for as long as you'd have me." I kissed her cheek and told her she would be the first I'd turn to. We did our jobs until we'd fulfilled our obligations. Jack and Philip looked like they'd run a marathon when we got to the club. Jimmy and Cynthia were still on the floor grinding on each other with abandon. I was amazed because I'd never seen her like that. She twirled, saw me, and let out a happy little scream, almost knocking me over when she jumped into my arms and gave me one scorcher of a kiss. "Honey, come on." A slow song started playing, and she molded to me as much as she could with the height difference. She looked into my eyes the whole time. By the time the song was over, she was subtly humping me, grinding her mound into my leg. I was afraid to look down because it felt like she left a wet spot. She sat while the rest danced, holding my hand until Celeste came up. "Give him up, honey. If he wants a good review, he's going to have to dance with the blogger." Jimmy giggled and pushed me to her. We danced for about a minute before the music changed and a slow song came on. Celeste didn't miss a beat, snuggling to me and putting her head on my shoulder. This went on for a couple of minutes until her head came up and she had a frown on her face. Jack had Jimmy on the floor and was all over her, and she didn't look like she was fighting it that hard. She danced us over and grabbed Jimmy, shoving her into my arms. "Don't be a fool, honey. Dance with your husband." She grabbed Jack, and they didn't look like a happy couple. We left when the song was over. Celeste and Jack seemed to be arguing, while Cynthia appeared to be trying to grind Philip's tool off on the floor. Jimmy was quiet on the way home and was asleep when I parked the car. I debated leaving her in the car, but love overcame anger, so I picked her up gently and put her to bed like a child. I was too keyed up to lie down, so I tried watching Curiosity Stream until I dozed off in my recliner. I woke up at 6:30 and knew I wouldn't go back to sleep, so I put coffee on and took a shower. 2 hours later, Jimmy crept into the kitchen and grabbed a cup. We sat for a while before she asked in a timid voice, "Did I do anything stupid last night?" Define stupid. Let me rephrase that. Did I do anything that could cause trouble in our relationship? I frowned while I organized my reaction. Not really, but you were close enough to the line that the least little nudge would have pushed you over it. More than borderline inappropriate action, at least once. If you want out of the marriage, tell me now, because I won't last much longer if you continue. Her reaction surprised me. She went pale and threw up all over the kitchen table, moaning no, over and over. I cleaned the table up, pushed Jimmy into the shower, and cleaned both of us and put her back to bed. She didn't get up until 5 in the afternoon. She found me dressed in a suit and was surprised. "I have to go back to the restaurant, remember? Celeste is coming over to finish her pictures for her blog post. You were supposed to go with me, but I don't think you're up to it. I should be back by 8 at the latest." I didn't give her a chance to argue, walking by her and leaving. Gene was nervous as this was his official opening. Yesterday had been by invitation only, and the menu was a bit more limited. This time, he featured a full menu and had been booked solid by 10 that morning. The kitchen was a madhouse, so I stayed out of the way as Celeste followed chefs, waiters, and prep workers around. After an hour, she was back at my table, sighing as she sat down. She grinned at me. "You still have your touch, honey. This place is going to be another gold mine for you." I relaxed as I sipped my coffee. The machine the resident barista insisted we have was worth its weight in gold. I grinned back. "I hope so. This is just the first step. Next year we'll be opening 2 new venues, one in Atlanta and another in Jacksonville. If those work out, we'll be nationwide and in Canada in 3 years. The ad guys are working on the tie-ins, the cookbooks, the personal appearances, television exposure, the whole enchilada. Jean may have to give up chef status before too much longer." Her eyes widened before she smiled. "You always play the long game, don't you? Your choices and investments always seemed random to me. It took a couple of years before I saw the method to your madness. How many facilities does Jody have now?" 19, and 2 more on tap before the end of the year. "And you own a chunk of all of them." I couldn't help grinning. "Yep, very small, but very profitable chunks. Got anything else up your sleeve?" "I'm looking at a couple of more opportunities. Things I don't want to discuss until they're a done deal." Her grin was wider. "I'm sure I'll read about it in the paper." Then she changed gears. "Want to talk about last night?" "A little. I haven't talked to Jimmy yet. What makes me wonder is if we'd been an hour later, what would we have found?" Celeste took my hand. "Don't rush into judgment. You know Jimmy loves you. I think she just had a bit too much to drink and it clouded her judgment. Besides, you saw how happy she was when we showed up. I had to admit she was right, but I didn't think it completely absolved Jimmy. I took my last sip of coffee. I'm going home now. We'll see what she says. Jimmy was all over me when I got home. The apologies coming fast and furious. I finally got her to calm down. I know you were drunk. That doesn't bother me that much. What does bother me is the fact that you got drunk in the company of two a-holes. Philip was all over a married woman, and Jack will screw anything that moves. He's the type who would see you being drunk as an opportunity. I want your word there will be no repeat of this situation. Do you understand? She swore on the lives of our unborn children it would never happen again. We went to bed, and when she touched me, I shut her down gently. You're still not 100%, honey. I don't want to make up sex that you're really not into. We'll play tomorrow. She sighed and snuggled into me. Promise? Promise. We did play the next night, and Jimmy put every ounce of love she had into it. For the next few months when we went out, she limited her alcohol intake quite a bit. The only time she would get the slightest bit tipsy was when it was just us, and she knew I'd take care of her. Jimmy was a sexual dynamo under normal circumstances, but after a bit of alcohol, she took it to a whole new level. I suspect that had quite a bit to do with her actions that night, and she agreed, promising me it would never happen again. There is a lot of effort that goes into staging a live play. There were endless rehearsals, costume fittings if the production was a period or fantasy piece, mild rewrites to adjust to the player's potential. Add the sound checks, the lighting adjustments, the blocking of the positions on stage that the audience could not see. Staging the props and prepping the backdrops in a short period of time kept the guild jumping until showtime. I was extremely busy with a few projects, so I had no time to volunteer. They all made me promise on pain of death to be at the opening, so I rearranged my schedule. Jimmy grinned like mad when I showed her the t-shirt I'd had made to wear to the premiere. It was a picture of her looking sexy, and the logo read, "I'm married to a thespian." I walked into the auditorium to be greeted by a very nervous-looking Celeste. She wasn't involved in the play. Her blog had taken off, and she was spending a lot of time on it. Sponsorship had picked up, especially from the food industry, and she had started doing remotes from organic farms, huge meat processing plants, small dairies, and then followed the food from farm and plant to the consumers, including grocery stores, farmers markets, and restaurants. My ad team helped her out, and she was now in the planning stages of a show we were going to pitch to food networks and PBS. One of my new projects was a video studio. Celeste had introduced me, and I toured the facility, meeting with the management team. They were transparent in their needs. We're doing really well and need to expand. Unfortunately, we've reached our credit limit, and the banks don't want to fund the expansion. We can make great videos and short films, but we have only minimal business experience. Celeste thinks we could be very beneficial to each other. I did my due diligence and liked what I saw. The two owners were pouring every dime of their personal money into a short animated film that showed a great deal of promise. Sadly, they were turning away business because they didn't have the capabilities. In the end, I bought a 60% stake in their business, paying off existing loans and getting them the funding they needed to expand. I explained the buyout clause I always offered, and they surprised me, asking me to wait 2 years before we discussed it again. That will give us time to look for a person to run the business end. In the meantime, we think you'll do quite well. The business was fascinating. If Celeste got her show, I was going to be executive producer, even if I wasn't really sure what that was. I grinned when I kissed her cheek. She was under a lot of stress trying to launch her show, and she and Jack weren't getting along that great. It's like he doesn't even miss me. We haven't played with each other, let alone with anyone else, in quite a while. It's like he could care less if I'm around. That set alarm bells ringing. Jack was the ultimate horn dog. If he wasn't getting it at home, I commiserated with her. Jimmy and I aren't getting the quality time we need either. I'm gone a lot, and she's either working and tied up in rehearsals. I'm going to ask her to take a break and concentrate on us for a while. I'm almost done traveling, and I'd like to revisit the children conversation. I'm 36, and I want to be able to chase them around when they come. Celeste smiled sadly. Early on, she and Jack had decided not to have children. He'd been snipped and wanted her to have her tubes tied, but she resisted. Great news, I said, thinking I could cheer her up. PBS and Home and Garden Network are interested, plus the Food Network called and wants a meeting with us. Looks like you're going to be a star, honey. She smiled but wasn't as happy as I expected. I didn't get to explain Home and Garden wanted a separate show focusing on farms and the food industry while PBS leaned more towards restaurants. She might end up doing 2 shows, crossing over materials where possible. Look, Roy, I need to prepare you. The show is about adultery, and originally included a bedroom scene about the cheaters' first time in bed together. I fought to have it cut and thought I was successful until Cynthia told me she put it back in just now. Please remember it's just a play and everyone is pretending. Just the way she said made me realize this wasn't going to be a pleasant experience. I was more than correct. The production was well written. You could follow the angst, the weakening of wills. There were a few scenes where the man and woman were each on opposite sides of a darkened stage, texting while the messages flashed up on an 8-foot screen behind them. Then came the secret lunches, the touches, the increased passion of their kisses. The lead male was Philip, and he played well off Jimmy. I had to wonder as I watched how hard it was for him, because it seemed to flow naturally. The final scene was them consummating their relationship. As a cheap motel sign flashed at the end of the stage, the spotlight hit a king-sized bed in the middle of the room. The players entered from different sides of the bed. Philip, in his arrogance, wore a male thong. I don't think any women in the audience were impressed with his size. Jimmy strode on stage. For all practical purposes, she may as well have been naked. She had on a sheer lacy red nightgown that just made it to her waist. The lights went out as they reached for each other. If they were expecting a huge round of applause, they were mistaken. There had been a few gasps and then silence, before a few tentative patrons applauded. Celeste had locked down on my hand and refused to let go. The lights went up, and the people that knew me had a hard time looking at me. Jimmy didn't even put on a robe as they took their bows, her nipples plainly visible every time she bent. I was beyond furious. I looked at Celeste. "You can let me go now." She held on tighter. "Calm down. Please, Roy. It was just a play. It doesn't mean anything." "Did you see the same things I did? Let me go, Celeste." She tried to hold on, and I gently reached down and grabbed her little finger, bending it backwards until she had to either let go or hear her finger snap. She finally let go with a gasp, and I turned and headed for the reception area where the players made a point of mingling with the patrons. Jimmy was between Philip and Jack, still in her gown and smiling hugely. The women were either not looking at her or with barely concealed contempt. The men were just staring. Jack had directed, and they were basking in accolades when I stood in front of them. Jimmy's smile faded when she saw the look on my face. "Get some goddamned clothes on." She ran backstage, leaving Philip and Jack. They were both smirking to beat the band. "Your wife is one hot." Whatever else Philip was going to say got swallowed when my fist met his jaw. I was big, pissed, and pretty strong thanks to Jody, and I knocked him cold. Jack turned to run, but I grabbed him by his long hair and dragged him backwards. "You a-hole. You thought I would stand still for this shit?" The smirk was back. "I don't give a shit what you stand still for, a-hole." Jimmy was all for it, especially the extra rehearsal time we put in to make it convincing. He joined Philip on the floor. Everyone was standing around horrified, and I locked onto two of the board of directors. "You approve this shit? Screw all of you. You'll get a letter Monday notifying the board that I'm withdrawing my patronage, and that of any of the companies I'm involved with." That shocked them. Between my personal patronage and my companies, it amounted to about 40% of their budget. They'd have to scramble to secure new patrons, or the season would be in jeopardy. They were trying to do damage control, saying the rehearsal they saw didn't have the bedroom scene in it, when Cynthia stormed up, screaming at the top of her lungs. "It was a play. None of it was real, you troglodyte." So, it was a pretend version of my wife swapping spit and parading around practically naked? Gee, that makes everything all right. Just because you screw around. You think every woman around you has to? Grow the hell up and stick those worn-out tits back in your dress. I don't think they impress guys like they did when you were 30. She went pale. Her tits were obviously supported by a very good bra that practically shoved them in your face. Worse than the insult was the shocked look on her husband's face. Celeste came up, gently reaching out. "Roy, please, calm down." I shook her hand away. "I thought you were my friend. You could have warned me, given me a chance to stop this mess. But you didn't. You think Jack is dicking her, don't you? Looks like old Jack wants to play solo now and leave you her." I stopped, seeing the look of horror on her face. It was a pretty open secret in the guild, but the general public didn't know about their lifestyle, and I almost outed them. "Sorry, see." That was all I got out before I got tackled to the ground by a huge woman. She was easily 6 feet or more and had to weigh about 250. The way she felt as she took me to the ground made me think very little of it was fat. It turned out Philip had a wife. What a clusters hit the night had turned into. She popped me a couple of times, and I'm here to tell you she did not hit like a girl. By then, the cops had arrived and she and I ended up in handcuffs. The EMTs were looking over Philip and Jack. Jack ended up with just a fat lip, but it seemed Philip wouldn't be getting any speaking roles for a while because I'd given him a hairline jaw fracture. It took them an hour to sort everything out. I was a local and supported the cops any way I could, and Philip was an outsider, so I got the benefit of the doubt. They got his wife to say they wouldn't press charges if I'd let her attack on me go. Celeste had left, supporting Jack as slow tears rolled down her cheeks. She was the only one I felt bad for in the whole sorry mess. Jimmy had first appeared in a robe, took in the scene and scurried away, coming back later in jeans and a tee. Her theatrical makeup was still on and she looked a right mess. I think raccoons would have been offended to be compared to her. I looked her dead in the eyes as soon as the handcuffs were off, yanking my shirt off and spitting on it before I threw it to the ground. She ran out of the hall crying, and I didn't see her until the next day. I looked pretty odd walking into the all-night Walmart in just a suit jacket and jeans, but it was really late at night and it was Walmart. I'm sure they've seen worse. I grabbed a couple of shirts and a pair of jeans, some underwear and socks. I had no intention of going home, so I crashed at a motel the next town over. My phone had been ringing constantly, so I put it on silent mode and didn't look at it until mid-morning the next day. 30 calls from Jimmy, 5 from different board members, 1, oddly enough, from Philip's wife, and 2 from Celeste. I listened to a few from Jimmy. They were what I expected. It was just a play. Nothing had happened. I was blowing this all out of proportion, and I needed to come home so she could explain it to me. I listened closely, but I never once heard an apology for what she'd done. I stopped after 8 and deleted the rest. The board members all echoed the same sentiment. It was just a play. They had no idea the bedroom scene had been reinserted. Jack and Philip were banned from the rest of the season. Cynthia had been asked to resign. It seemed to me they were trying to make it right, so I might give them the benefit of the doubt. The one from the a-hole's wife was interesting. Look, I don't know who needs to apologize here. You shouldn't have hit him so hard. I shouldn't have jumped you. I don't think anything happened, but if it did and you have proof, I would ask that you share it. I agree the bedroom scene was in mighty poor taste, but I think Jack and my husband feed off each other, and your wife got caught in the middle. That won't be a problem in the future. I've told him in no uncertain terms he's done with the guild, and if he can't generate some decent income from acting within the next 6 months, he's going to have to get a real job. He only started with the guild to gather a little more exposure. Well, it seemed at least one of the bunch had some character. I called back, and we had a lengthy conversation. We didn't part friends exactly, but we weren't sworn enemies. It was a little more difficult to talk to Celeste. When she answered, I started talking, so she didn't have a chance. Look, I'm sorry about last night. I was pretty upset and I may have overreacted. Your lifestyle is your business as long as it doesn't bleed over to mine. I like you a lot, honey, but you have some decisions to make. Decisions I don't think will include Jack in the long run. If I see him again anytime soon, he'll probably have another fat lip. I would prefer you not cut me out of your life, but if you have to, I'll understand. When I ran out of breath, there was silence. Then she started. You hurt me, Roy. In all the time I've known you, you've never said anything directly negative about my lifestyle. Jack can be an a-hole, and at times he can go too far. He should have never put that bedroom scene back in. I suspect he did it just to piss you off. He feels threatened by you, Roy. You're smarter than he is, way more successful. But most of all, you have a much larger tool and nothing threatens him more. He's firmly convinced you and I are screwing because we're together so much. He's sure, and I'm using his words, that one day you'll screw me with that big meat and I'll be ruined.